Coming up! After a devastating surprise attack by Japan that took thousands of American lives, the United States needed a ray of hope to increase morale among the military and civilians. In a bold and unprecedented gamble, American commanders come together to try and execute one of the most single, daring, and influential missions in the history of warfare. In this video, we will break down the tactics, execution, and outcome of a legendary mission that would see Army bombers taking off of a Navy carrier to hit the most prestigious target in the Japanese Empire. Welcome to my brand new series, Battle Breakdowns by TJ3 History. Episode 1, The Doolittle Raid on Tokyo. In case you guys haven't seen, I've got some great new fanware. If you want to support TJ3 History and grab something awesome, please check out the link in the description. Enjoy. It is December of 1941. Pearl Harbor has just been bombed by the Japanese, leaving thousands dead and the American fleet crippled. The morale among the American people is low, and they look to President Franklin D. Roosevelt for encouragement.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
His words are strong following the attack, but the public is in desperate need of a morale boost. The only thing that can provide this is striking back against Japan. So, on December 21st of 1941, the American Commander-in-Chief meets with military leaders to try and come up with a plan. Unfortunately, there is no clear option. Being an island nation, Japan is a difficult target to strike. The bombers of the U.S. Navy can be moved in close to the coast from aircraft carriers, but this would likely leave the Pacific Fleet exposed. This is extremely risky due to the threat of losing the ever-valuable aircraft carriers. The Army bombers have a much longer range, but they can only take off of airfields. Pearl Harbor has plenty of bombers and airstrips, but is well out of range of Japan. The same is true of the airfields at Midway Island. This unfortunately leaves the U.S. with no real way to strike back on Japanese soil. That is until an American submarine commander by the name of Francis S. Lowe comes up with a brilliant and daring idea. He suggests that some of the Army bombers can actually take off of American aircraft carriers. He explains that he has noted this from watching the American bombers train on airstrips that have outlines of aircraft carriers on them. Using this strategy, they could potentially reach Japan without bringing their prized carriers too close to the enemy. With this information now in mind, a bold plan was put together. The U.S. carriers with B-25s on board would set sail for Japan. Then, at roughly 400 miles out at sea, the bombers would take off to hit Tokyo, while the rest of the fleet would turn back for friendly waters. Then, after dropping their bombs, the raiders would fly over the China Sea to hopefully land at friendly Chinese airfields. It was risky, but Navy Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey, Army Air Commanders Henry Hap Arnold, and Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle were convinced that it was doable with the right men and machines. On the other hand, it would be an extremely high-risk mission for the brave aviators who carried it out. And even if they were successful, the damage would likely be minimal. Bombs falling on Tokyo, however, would instill fear in the hearts of Japanese citizens and prompt the military to divert scarce resources from other theaters. But more importantly, such a dramatic attack would fan the embers of American nationalism and strengthen tense relations with England and the Soviet Union, both of which had been waiting for the slumbering Yankee war machine to rise and join the fight. To give the brash endeavor any chance of success, Doolittle was tasked with coordinating and personally leading the mission, not from a carrier, but from the cockpit of a bomber. It was a huge gamble, but the potential payoff was well worth the risk. The raid itself wouldn't take place until mid-April, but the feasibility of launching bombers from aircraft carriers was tested months earlier off the coasts of Virginia and Florida. These twin-engine bombers were much different and larger than the normal Navy fighters that were taking off from aircraft carriers. This was something unprecedented and had never been done before. Martin B-26 Marauders and Douglas B-23 Dragons were considered, but with its relatively short wings, abundant lift, and favorable handling characteristics, the North American B-25 Mitchell won out. In preparation, aircraft from the 17th Bombardment Group were stripped of heavy and unnecessary equipment like defensive gun turrets and bomb sights. Under optimum conditions, the twin-engine bombers were capable of lifting in the air from the carrier's short decks, but exhaustive trials proved that getting them back on board safely just was not practical. The all-volunteer pilots and crewmen were not told much, only that their mystery mission would be extremely hazardous, which they knew was the military's roundabout way of saying that they probably would not make it back home. Despite the inherent risks, for more than a month they honed their high-speed cross-country flying, nighttime navigation, and low-level bombing skills. During these rigorous weeks, the young pilots and crew learned to master every aspect of the B-25 and learned to fly it like a fighter, fast and low. Just after dawn on April 2nd, the last of the 16 modified B-25s were hoisted onto the flight deck of the 20,000-ton aircraft carrier USS Hornet at the Naval Air Station in Almeida, and along with a complement of cruisers, destroyers, and oilers, Task Force 18 steamed out of foggy San Francisco Bay. That afternoon, Captain Mark Mitcher and Jimmy Doolittle revealed the mission to the airmen for the first time.
Not until they are miles at sea do these men know definitely the mission for which they have volunteered. Now their thoughts go back to their months of careful preparation, clothed in the greatest secrecy. Only Colonel Doolittle knew that Japan was to be their target. Now they realize that the miniature cities laid out for practice bombing near an American airfield duplicated military objectives: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka.
On April 13th, the raiders link up with Task Force 16 and the USS Enterprise at Midway Island, the last friendly location in the Pacific. Then they group up and head westward for Japan. In a final briefing, Halsey and Doolittle inform crews of their primary and secondary targets. The B-25s will be divided into smaller groups, all of which will be led by Doolittle, and they'll spread themselves out over a wide area to limit the defenders' ability to concentrate ground fire and fighter aircraft. The crews are also told that civilian targets like the Imperial Palace complex in downtown Tokyo are strictly off-limits. It was also here that, as a symbol of reprisal, Jimmy Doolittle attached to one of the bombs peace medals that had been given to the U.S. from Japan just weeks before Pearl Harbor. As the sun rises on the planned launch day, all is going well. The task force is currently about 650 miles east of Japan, and the bombers will be taking off later in the day. At approximately 7:38 a.m., however, a wrinkle is thrown into the plans that could disrupt the entire mission. On the horizon of the Pacific, a Japanese patrol vessel is sighted.
General quarters, all hands man your battle station.
It's a Jap patrol boat, and the task force intends to destroy it before a warning can be radioed to Japan.
These were expected, but Admiral Halsey did not plan to see them this far out at sea. The ship is sunk by the USS Nashville shortly after, and a handful of prisoners are captured, but the element of surprise has been lost. The Japanese patrol boat has radioed the location of the American fleet to the Japanese Naval Command, who will likely be assembling a strike force within the hour. This puts Doolittle and Captain Mark Mitcher of the USS Hornet in a tough situation. They were currently 170 miles out of their planned launch location and 10 hours ahead of schedule. If the bombers take off now, there is no guarantee that they would have the fuel to make it all the way to China. But if they continued onward to the launch point, they risk the aircraft carriers, the most valuable asset in the Pacific. No doubt making one of the toughest decisions of the war, Doolittle and Mitcher decide to launch immediately. For the planes and airmen, the odds of their survival have just gotten a lot worse. Shortly following the order, planes are readied and the crews are sent to the flight deck. At 8:20 a.m. on April 18th, less than an hour after the sighting of the Japanese patrol, the airmen will attempt to take off their B-25s from the carrier, against all odds and in far from ideal conditions. Nonetheless, the raiders strap into their stripped-down B-25s and prepare to launch. The bow of the USS Hornet is aimed into the wind and Doolittle pushes his throttle to the max. In a moment of hope, suspense, and prayer, the first of the 16 B-25s leave the flight deck, successfully getting into the air. More than one bomber cuts it close, however, but within an hour, all 16 of the B-25s are airborne and en route to Japan. 4 hours later, the bombers are approaching the Japanese coastline. As they have been instructed, the bombers will fly at a low altitude to avoid detection from Japanese aircraft or ships. The nerves of the mission likely gnaw at most of the young airmen who are heading in to see combat for the first time. They are also likely well aware that leaving 10 hours early means that they could very well end up ditching in the Chinese Sea. When they reach the coast, the bombers begin to fan out and split up as planned to hit their respective targets. Each plane has a specific industrial or military target that they will be aiming for in order to spread out the raid and make it more difficult for the Japanese to concentrate planes and anti-aircraft fire. This strategy proves to be effective because as they near Tokyo, enemy resistance is actually fairly low. The B-25s are flying so low that it is difficult to hit them with anti-aircraft fire. Most bombers take virtually no damage at all, and none of the raiders are even injured from ground offenses. In addition, the force is engaged by multiple Japanese fighters, but they also miss their marks. Once their targets on the ground come into sight, the raiders line up the aircraft and open bomb bay doors. It is now in just seconds that all the many months of training and planning will pay off. The bombardiers use their specialized low-level bomb sights to make sure they are online, and then once the targets enter their crosshairs, it is bombs away. Their payloads fall down onto the unsuspecting Japanese and ignite many shipyards, ammo dumps, and oil stores into flames. The raiders have landed direct hits on many of their targets, and the Japanese, who previously thought Tokyo was impossible to attack, are quickly brought to realize that they are far from invincible. The airmen quickly drop back to low level and watch the fire and smoke rage behind them. Less than an hour after the last bomb was dropped, uncensored Japanese radio broadcasts report that a large fleet of enemy planes has just attacked the city. Picked up by the Naval Task Force radio operators, it is Halsey's first confirmation that the mission was a success. It is good news, but for the pilots and crew, their journey is far from over. Now running dangerously low on fuel, they head out across the East China Sea toward friendly air bases in the mainland of China. Although the skies had been clear over Tokyo, the weather then takes a turn for the worse. Easing back on the sticks and climbing to 6,000 feet, the pilots try to get over the storm, but fairly soon visibility is nearly zero, and they are forced to fly on instruments alone. They are now in what may be the most psychologically challenging part of the entire mission. As they have been over the sea for quite some time, they search desperately for China to come into view. After leaving well ahead of schedule, most of the B-25s are nearly out of fuel and cannot stay in the air much longer. In addition, their crews are exhausted after being in the air for over 13 hours. As time continues to tick away, 3 B-25s run out of fuel in the South China Sea. These crew members bail out over the ocean and will do what they can to make it to shore. It is very likely that none of the Doolittle raiders would have made it to China had it not been for a fortunate turn of fate that gave them a strong tailwind which increased their speed by 29 miles an hour. Shortly after this, at approximately 2200 hours, a beautiful sight for the exhausted airmen comes into view, the coast of China. They now have dry earth to land their aircraft on and hopefully friendly Chinese civilians to aid them. Once over the mainland, most of the B-25s begin to prepare their planes to land or bail out. Doolittle orders his crew to bail out before setting autopilot and bailing himself. They all make it down safely shortly after. Some other crews follow suit bailing out, while others choose to crash land in Chinese fields. Nearly all of the remaining crews reach the ground safely within the hour. At the end of the day, of the 80 total airmen who left as a part of the raid, 68 were accounted for. 64 of the raiders, including Doolittle and his crew, have successfully reached the Chinese and are aided by civilians and government officials. Miraculously, they would all make it back to the United States by the end of the conflict, or would end up volunteering to serve in other campaigns of the war. The Chinese would be fiercely punished for helping the raiders escape. Multiple cities and villages were punished and burned as reprisals. Some estimates have the total death count among Chinese civilians as high as 250,000 for their part in aiding the Americans. Overall, the cost of the raid was extremely high for all of China. Of the other 16 raiders who were not able to reach the Chinese, 5 crewmen on board one of the B-25s actually were forced to land at an Allied Soviet airfield. But because of the peace agreement they had with Japan, they were forced to imprison the U.S. crew. The airmen, however, were treated well and would intentionally be freed less than a year later. Corporal Leland Factor was killed during a failed bailout attempt over China. The remaining 10 crewmen were still unaccounted for. It would later be learned that these 2 bomber crews were captured by the Japanese after landing in the Chinese Sea. 2 of the missing crewmen, Bombardier William Dieter and flight engineer Donald Fitzmaurice, were found to have drowned when their B-25 crashed into the sea. Both of their remains were recovered after the war and would be buried with military honors at the Golden Gate National Cemetery. Less than 6 months after being captured, 3 of the other crew, Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Harold Spatz, would be tried for war crimes. They were executed by firing squad. Robert Metter would be another fatality of these crews when he would die of sickness in captivity a year later. These raiders would also be buried with full military honors after the war. Of the 8 airmen who would be captured by the Japanese, 4 would make it back home following the end of the war. 3 of these raiders would actually go on to live well past the year 2000. Following the raid, Doolittle expected a court-martial after all of the aircraft were lost. Instead, upon his return to the United States, he was given the Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt. All of the other raiders, both alive and missing, were given the Distinguished Flying Cross. Every raider was also decorated by the Chinese government.
Later in China, the flyers who bailed out safely are decorated by Madame Chiang Kai-shek. All survivors, except the crew of one plane which landed safely in Russia and were interned, reach America and are decorated by General Arnold, head of the American Army Air Forces.
After the war ended, the 61 Doolittle raiders who survived the conflict would get together for a reunion in 1946. The men enjoyed it so much that they made it an annual affair. In 1959, a new tradition began when the city of Tucson, Arizona, gifted the raiders with 80 silver goblets, one for each of the raiders. At each reunion from that point on, the raiders would toast the goblets with a sip of vintage 1896 Hennessy cognac. Then they would turn over the goblets of any of the men who had passed away since their last meeting. The last living Doolittle raider, Dick Cole, would pass away in 2019 at the age of 103. He was the co-pilot of Jimmy Doolittle's lead bomber. After having their annual reunion for over 40 years, with Cole's passing, the last of the goblets was finally flipped over. They are now on permanent display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. I hope you enjoyed this historical recreation. Please make sure to click subscribe and comment if you have any ideas for future videos. If you want to support my content and get awesome bonus videos, please check out the Patreon link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.